Hi, it's Jamie Batch, your instructor for Bio 221, and we're going to run through the last chapter of the semester, which is chapter 28, all about the reproductive system, which most students are already familiar with, kind of the nuts and bolts, so to speak, of the reproductive system. Obviously, we go into a lot more detail than what you may have gone into in a high school class or middle school class or whatever. There's some more details to the anatomy. The physiology is pretty straightforward though, so it shouldn't be too heavy of a chapter to get through. I'm just going to walk through some of the things. I'll be honest with you, this is my third time making this video. For some reason my computer still doesn't like me. So I'm going to try not to forget all of the important stuff that I'm supposed to say, even though I feel like I'm saying it for the third time, because I am. The chapter starts off on page 1017 with the functions of the reproductive system, which are different for males and females, so that's important to understand why they're different. Obvious reasons. Females are bearing the children and responsible for nourishing the children, the babies after they're born, and males are responsible for making lots and lots and lots of sperm, pretty much, and getting that sperm to the egg. So the male reproductive system, the anatomy starts on that same page. Everything is pretty straightforward. There's some muscles, the Dardan's muscle and the cremaster muscle, which you may be familiar with, but you didn't know that's what they were called. Then there's a hormone chart on page 1018 that you should be familiar with a little bit already from chapter 18 last semester, when we talked about the endocrine system and the major hormones involved. Now the focus of that chapter was not on the reproductive hormones, so this is where you're going to get the majority of that. You will recognize FSH and LH from that chapter because those are pituitary hormones, and probably GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, but we didn't get into too much of the progesterone, the testosterone, the estrogen functions back in chapter 18, so you should be familiar with those. I suggest taking a sheet of paper, folding it in like 4 columns, and then having 1 column for the name, 1 column for the source, 1 column for the target tissue, and 1 column for the effects or the response to that hormone. So you should be familiar with those. The next page shows you mid-sagittal anatomy of the male, and couple interesting things, and you'll probably see this in lab, maybe on the models. That ductus deferens, which is sometimes also called the vas deferens, goes up and around and behind the bladder, which most men don't realize, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. What else is interesting? The different tissue layers of the penis. There's the erectile tissue that's in the penis, and then there's like a spongy tissue that's around the urethra, and that's really everything. I mean, all of the parts are labeled, so not too tricky there. You will see a diagram of the seminal vesicles on page 1020. That's pretty interesting. I like the microscopic view that you see. It's letter A on that page, or letter B rather, on that page, and what that is it's zooming into the seminiferous tubules. The seminal vesicles are within the testes, and they are basically lots and lots and lots of tubes, and the lining of those tubes is where that sperm is made. And you can see much better in that cartoon version towards the left side of that page those sperm with the tails. They're very recognizable, and the actual anatomy of the sperm in letter C there. What most students are not familiar with is the actual descent of the testes and how different hormones and different muscles change throughout development, and that is covered on page 1021, so you should be familiar with that. On page 1023 is what I was alluding to with those seminal vesicles, that progression of sperm development and maturation, which occurs within those tubules in the testes. It's actually a pretty interesting process, and I think the way it is created is interesting here, because all of the sperm, the fully developed, although they're not quite fully developed yet, they end up in the lumen, and then they can get pushed out into the epididymis, and then from there into the ductus deferens, and so on and so forth. But what you see here is the actual process of sperm formation. So on that outer edge, the serosa, if you will, of the seminal tubules, what you have are the sperm stem cells, which are called spermatogonium, and they're going to undergo a mitotic process. Now remember, mitosis creates two identical daughter cells. So the two cells that are created off of that mitosis is one new spermatogonium and one new primary spermatocyte. And as I told you, I've done this a couple times already, so I already have it drawn out for you. So here's the process in action. You have that spermatogonia, or that stem cell, undergoing mitosis, producing two cells. One is a spermatogonia. I ran out of room there. One is a primary spermatocyte. That primary spermatocyte then undergoes meiosis 1. Now the difference between mitosis and meiosis is something that you may recall from chapter 3, very important. We'll hit some of the major differences in just a minute. So those cells that are created from the primary spermatocytes are called secondary spermatocytes. And so there would be two secondary spermatocytes created from the one primary spermatocyte. These two secondary spermatocytes then divide and create spermatids. Spermatids are the immature form of the spermatozoa, which we know and love and call sperm. I say that jokingly. We love sperm, right? Kind of weird. Sorry. So let's see. Let's talk about the differences between mitosis and meiosis. So one of the major differences is the number of divisions. Mitosis is just one division. Meiosis is two divisions. Mitosis creates two identical daughter cells. Meiosis creates 4 haploid cells. Haploid cells are half cells that do not contain all of the DNA needed. I'm just looking back in chapter 3 to see, there's a little bit of mitosis there. Sorry. So these cells that are created in meiosis are only containing half of the amount of DNA that's needed for a living cell, which makes sense because the sperm that have half the DNA and the egg that has half the DNA combine to make a full set. One other major difference, and you'll see it there on page 1025 up in prophase 1, towards the left side of that page, an event called crossing over or genetic recombination. It's the same thing happens, where these chromosomes, these duplicated chromosomes, cross over each other and exchange parts. And this is this genetic shuffling, which is the reason why we're all different. It's why you're different from your brothers and sisters unless you are an identical twin. So that process you should be familiar with since it's covered in this chapter. The process of mitosis is not covered in this chapter, but you should know that at this point in your education. Let's see, what else is important? There is an anterior view of the male anatomy, just giving you a different view of that spermatic cord that holds the testes in place. Just a little different from that sagittal view. Okay, then we get into the actual physiology and the regulation that goes on with the male reproductive system. And really this is happening with several different feedback mechanisms rooting from the pituitary. So you have what's known as pulses, and I don't quite remember the rate of the pulses. It's fairly frequent. Fairly frequent. I'm just scanning just to see, and that's my printer being weird. It's I want to say it's like every 2 hours or so. Anyways, these pulses of GnRH surge, and that causes an increase in LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So these pulses of LH and FSH surge in the bloodstream, and they go to their target tissues, which are mainly the testes. And they're targeting what's called the interstitial cells of the testes, and they're these little cells that are surrounding this the seminal vesicles, or within the seminal tubules, and they're then going to release testosterone. Because the FSH and LH are coming, testosterone will be released. And that testosterone is what fuels sperm development, that mitosis and meiosis process that we just talked about. The presence of sperm is then going to cause the seminal vesicles to release another hormone called inhibin. And inhibin travels in the blood, goes back up to the pituitary, and says, hey, we have enough sperm, let's turn off the cycle. So then FSH and LH are turned off, and the sperm swim on their way into the holding tank of the epididymis. 2 hours later, I'm saying 2 hours, I don't remember the exact pulse frequency. I don't even know if this book mentions the pulse frequency as I'm looking at that page. But either way, just a little bit later, the pulse happens again, more sperm are produced, inhibin's released, the cycle's turned off, etc., etc. It's an example of negative feedback, just like we see with almost every endocrine function in the body. So that's one thing, and that's diagrammed out for you on page 1031, the cycle of GnRH, FSH, and LH, and the process of spermatogenesis. Next couple of pages go into the effects of testosterone, the secondary sex characteristics, puberty, and the onset of puberty in males. That's pretty straightforward. The physiology of an erection is pretty straightforward. The big deal there is that it's nitric oxide acting as the neurotransmitter to dilate the blood vessels to hold the blood to maintain an erection. That's the big deal there. Then we get into the female reproductive system. And again, the nuts and bolts, so to speak, are on 1035. You see a sagittal and anterior view. The sagittal view is interesting for a lot of men, as well as some women who may not be aware that there are several holes in that area. There's not just one. And the general positioning of the bladder to the uterus, the bladder is most anterior, uterus, and then rectum. And this might make sense to you if you've ever been pregnant before. Just imagine that uterus being huge and pushing on that bladder, pushing that bladder towards the pelvic bone there, and there's really not a whole lot of room in there. You can also see some of the extra ligaments that you may not be familiar with there in the anterior view, the broad ligament, the ovarian ligament. What you may also notice is that, especially for old school people like myself, when I took anatomy and physiology, we called the tube that connects the ovary to the uterus, we called it the fallopian tube. It's no longer called the fallopian tube. It's now called the uterine tube. And those uterine tubes carry the oocyte, or egg cell, from the ovary down into the uterus. So, let's talk about the ovaries. There's a cross-section of the ovary on page 1036. There are lots and lots of parts to the ovary that you should be familiar with. The majority of the parts are related to the developing oocytes, or the developing egg cells. So it is important to understand what all of those parts are. There's different zones, there's different supporting structures in there. The whole purpose is to support the developing egg, so that when that egg is released, it is healthy, it is full of nutrients, it is ready to be fertilized and make a beautiful, perfect baby. So that's what you see going on there. You can also see the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is kind of like the empty egg shell after ovulation has occurred. And you can also see a corpus albicans, which is like the old withered away corpus luteum from the previous month. So let's talk about the process of meiosis and oocyte maturation. It's called oogenesis, kind of a cool word, that occurs in females. It actually happens, it begins at birth, it begins in utero. It begins before the baby girl is even born. So in other words, males don't start producing sperm until puberty and those pulses of GnRH are occurring. Females will actually create all of their oocytes in utero. Before they're even born, their bodies are preparing for them to be mothers. Kind of crazy, right? Especially if you have a little girl. I have a 4-year-old. girl. That's just crazy to me to think that. And what you see is the pathway that occurs. So before birth, you have the oogonia, which is the stem cell, kind of like the spermatogonia, same thing. It's going to undergo that mitotic division, producing that primary oocyte and another oogonium, right? Those kind of hold and are in place and waiting until puberty to set forth and for that monthly cycle to kick in and the hormones to continue that development. So in other words, all the primary oocytes that a female will have, she has when she is born, and it's roughly, you know, a couple million. It's a huge, huge number. Does it say? It doesn't say. But the number decreases to about 300,000. Ooh. So imagine how many it starts with between birth and puberty, and then those 300,000 or so, obviously only one is selected every month to develop. And that all happens with the influx of hormones. And you'll see if you look towards the end of that chart that the second mitotic division actually isn't even finished until fertilization occurs. So that sperm is needed in order for that last meiotic division to occur. Kind of interesting, and a totally different cycle than the males. And then what you see on the other side of that chart is the follicle maturation. So the oocyte is the egg that is within the follicle. The follicle is the cells and the supporting structures that are going to help that egg develop. So you have the primordial follicles that are containing the primary oocytes before birth. And then as puberty hits, those primordial follicles develop along with the primary oocyte, all in preparation for ovulation. That's what it's all about. So kind of an interesting chart there. Goes on through more anatomy. Again, that's fairly straightforward. The breasts are included in the reproductive chapter because that is for nourishing newborns. There are just a few major landmarks, so to speak, related to the breast tissue, the lobules, the lobes, and some of the ducts and stuff like that. Nothing too tricky compared to what we've been through already. The trickiest part of this chapter really is the physiology of the female cycle, and you might, guys in this class might say, oh, well, females already know this stuff, but really there's a lot going on, and most women are not aware of it. You know that you have that certain time of the month, but other than that, most women are not aware of all of the other things that are going on. So there's really no leg up here. There's no advantage. First of all, when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, what we're talking about really is a kind of a grouping of two cycles, the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle. That's really what's meant when everyday women are saying menstrual cycle this, menstrual cycle that. There's really two cycles that are within that. You have the ovarian cycle, as I mentioned, and that all has to do with the developing follicle and ovulation. And you also have the uterine cycle, which is the growth and deterioration and removal of that layer of the uterus called the endometrium. And you see it all there on page 1044. It starts on day 1 of menses. So the first day a woman has her period, the first day she starts bleeding, is the beginning of both of those cycles. And you can see, just looking up the chart, what's happening. You can see moderate levels of LH, low levels of FSH, that developing follicle or primary oocytes, very, very small, nothing much going on there, relatively low levels of progesterone and estrogen, and again, the shedding of the uterine wall. Those levels of progesterone and estrogen continue to increase up until about day 14. At day 14, LH peaks and FSH peaks and estrogen peak. And because of that peaking, that's causing that egg to erupt from the ovary, and that is what we call ovulation. So ovulation is when that egg hatches, so to speak, out of the follicle and is released down into the uterine tube. And as you can see by looking at the uterine piece of this chart, the uterine lining continues to develop because your body is going to assume that fertilization is going to occur. So your body's preparing for that. So as that egg is released and it's assumed that it's been fertilized, your uterus is continuing to prepare for that. What's happening to hormone levels? Estrogen levels plummet, progesterone levels rise. The progesterone that's being released after ovulation is due to the corpus luteum, that extra shell from the follicle that oocyte hatched out of. So that corpus luteum continues to release progesterone, and that progesterone is going to fuel extra growth in the endometrium, in that uterus. Meanwhile, FSH and LH levels drop. So that is the cycle. Fertilization doesn't occur. Your body senses that there's no implantation going on. Well, then that uterine lining is shed and everything goes back down to normal and the whole cycle starts again. The chart on page 1045 summarizes the hormones that occur during all of those parts. Honestly, if you're a chart person, that's a good chart to memorize and pay attention to. If you're more visual, learn the diagram. That chart is basically summarizing the diagram that's on page 1044. Pretty straightforward. You see the hormone cycles, the negative feedback loop on page 1046. It's pretty much the same as what's going on in the males, except you don't have the inhibin being released, and the pulse frequency is once a month as opposed to every couple of hours or so. What are some other things they talk about in this chapter? The various phases of the uterus, the menses, proliferative, secretory phase, and secretory is referring to secreting hormones in preparation for implantation. We then have a discussion of fertility and pregnancy, and you have that diagram there on page 1049 showing the act of fertilization where those sperm are moving through the uterus, up the uterine tube, and where fertilization typically occurs. Most successful pregnancies occur a few days or sometimes even a few hours after ovulation, when that oocyte is up in the very distal end of the uterine tube, and really before that curve in that ampulla area. Now, that doesn't mean that fertilization can't occur when the egg is in the uterus or when it's anywhere else. Obviously it can, but there's really just a really small window for the most successful pregnancies. And in some cases, it might be hard to understand how this works, but in some cases, fertilization does occur in the uterus, but by then all the lining and all of the progesterone has started to decrease, so the fertilized egg is secreted anyways, and the woman wouldn't even know that she had been pregnant. So just kind of something to think about there, kind of nature taking its course, so to speak. There's also a discussion of ectopic pregnancies, which are pregnancies that occur when that embryo implants in the uterine tube. Very dangerous, could be very dangerous. Menopause is discussed, which is when those pulses of GnRH become infrequent and then finally stop, and the woman stops menstruating. Her uterine and ovarian cycles are no longer happening. You can see what occurs in terms of hormone levels during pregnancy, first, second, third trimester, what's going on with progesterone, estrogen, as well as HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. There's a little discussion of contraceptives, which you should be familiar with, and then age-related changes that occur in males and females, infertility, and uterine tumors like fibroids. So great job this semester, guys. Please let me know if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything in this. There wasn't really much to draw. It was a very straightforward chapter, so I just did it in one. Well, I try to make it quick. Sorry, 25 minutes. Ooh, sorry. Have a good one. Bye.